Good afternoon, colleagues. Once again, colleagues, before we move forward or with the proceeding of the workshop, I would like to notify you that this workshop is recorded for the purpose of keeping the records, as well as for those colleagues who will want the recording and the resources of this workshop at a later stage. So don't be surprised if you see that the recording has started. We are recording all our workshops and keep the recording so that our participants and those that were not able to attend during the period of the workshop can access the recording at a later stage. So, with that being said, colleagues, my name is Kosie Tuntuli. On behalf of the Research Capacity Development Unit at the Postgraduate School, I am delighted to welcome you to today's visual workshop titled Managing Conflicts of Interest and Ethical Dilemmas in Research. I would like to welcome each and every one of you and thanking you for taking your time to partake or to attend today's workshop. And our facilitator for today's workshop is Dr. Lorenzo David. So this workshop is especially tailored for supervisors, academics, researchers, and postdoctoral research fellows, as well as the postgraduate students, those who might be attending. You are more than welcome in today's workshops. And the aim of this workshop is to support ethical awareness and responsible research conduct across all levels of academic work. As I've mentioned earlier, that our facilitator is Dr. Lorenzo. David, we are honored to have you to facilitate today's session. Dr. Lorenzo will be guiding us through the key aspects of identifying, managing, and resolving conflicts of interest and ethical gray areas that may arise during the research process. This is an essential conversation for fostering a culture of transparency, trust, and ethical accountability in research. So, before I can hand over to Dr. Lorenzo, I would like to go through some housekeeping rules. Please engage actively during the session. Use the chat, raise your hand, or share your experience. We value your input. Please make sure your mic is muted when not speaking. However, I will enable all your mics at the beginning of the workshop. And if you do have a question, just raise a hand. Alternatively, you can type in your question at the chat. I will notify Dr. Lorenzo that someone has a question or an input. Also, I'll be sharing a feedback evaluation form at the beginning, during, and at the end of the session. We kindly request you colleagues to fill that feedback in. It helps us to improve our service offerings. So with that being said, now colleagues, allow me to introduce our facilitator for today. We are honored to have Dr. Lorenzo David as our facilitator for today's workshop. Uh, Dr. Lorenzo David is currently a coordinator at the Research Capacity Development Unit, Postgraduate School, University of Johannesburg. Dr. David was recently awarded a PhD in biochemistry for his assessment of transferring tech gold palladium and gold palladium bimetallic nanoparticles and their potential for anti-cancer drug delivery at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. By adopting a holistic approach to education, Dr. Lorenzo David hopes to inspire students to achieve personal and academic success with a hands-on and learner-centric approach to value-based learning. So, with that, I will now hand over to Dr. Lorenzo David. And thank you, Dr. Lorenzo, for taking your time. Just a quick reminder before I hand over to Dr. Lorenzo David. Colleagues, we will be moving out from Moodle community as well as sending out emails for registering of the workshop. Alternatively, I will share the registration link to the management system, whereby now you'll be finding all our offerings, the events, the workshop, the seminars that we are having at the Research Capacity Development Unit, whereby you can register for those workshops and attend them. So the platform is available on Ulink, and you just log into Ulink and you go to services. The last option is RCDMS. If you are having inquiries or you having problems with registering your profile, kindly send us your email address or send us your query to Supervision Cause or Lorenzo David. The email is, I will share on the chat my email as well as Dr. Lorenzo's email. So, and after the session, we will be assisting those who are interested or who will be wanting to be registered to the platform. So with that being said, I now hand over to our facilitator, Dr. Lorenzo. You can start with your workshop. Thank you so much for attending and taking your time to facilitate today's workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nkosi, and just welcome to all the attendees. We'd like to thank you all for making the time to join us today on this important topic. So as we know, the title of the presentation is actually going to focus around managing conflicts of interest as well as ethical dilemmas in research. So we're just going to provide a bit of background, provide some case studies, as well as some practical strategies about how we can identify as well as manage, especially when it comes to conflicts of interest and our ethical dilemmas. So I will begin by sharing my screen. Mr. Nkosi, if you can just let me know if you're able to see it. I'm just putting it into presenter mode now. Are you able to see my screen?
Okay. I can see your screen. If the colleagues can also confirm if they can see the screen.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm unable to see any hands or any reactions. So please, if at any point during the presentation you'd like to add something or maybe even bring about a point of discussion, we really would appreciate some input. We'd like to try and make these sessions to be as engaging as possible. Because we understand that we all have different experiences, especially when it comes to research. And I strongly believe that we can learn from one another. I mean, we're always learning, no matter what level we may be at. So please, any inputs that you have would be greatly appreciated. And I hope this will be an engaging session. So I'm going to try, and as with many of the presentations, I'm going to try and keep it around below an hour. Reason being is I'd like us to engage a bit more and try and bring up some discussion, as well as ensure that, we're getting maximum benefit, hopefully, from this. So as we understand, I've broken up this presentation into two areas, as the title suggests. And I think at first I'd like to go through conflicts of interest and how this plays a role in research. What is the importance of it? What is its definition? And how do we go about navigating, especially when we encounter conflicts of interest in our research environment? So as you can see, my slides are going to be quite bare. Reason being is I'd like to talk more on these points and hopefully bring up some discussion once more, as I've said. So let's begin with defining what a conflict of interest is. So a conflict of interest arises whenever there is a potential bias which could affect a researcher's work. And we'll go into more detail in terms of financial versus non-financial conflicts of interest and how these play a role in impacting our research as well as the integrity of our research. I think we all sitting here today understand that research should always be objective and unbiased. And these are two of the cornerstones of research, because if we want our research to be credible, if we want people to be able to trust it, we need to obviously be objective, present the results which we've gotten from our experiments or any protocols that we've been using, just so that we're maintaining the integrity once more of our research. So when researchers have personal interests that could potentially compromise their objectivity, automatically we can identify that a conflict will arise or it is existing. So I want to be clear in saying this, that if there is a conflict of interest, this does not necessarily mean that misconduct has occurred. If you have a conflict of interest in your research, it does not invalidate your research. It does not, it does not mean that you're performing misconduct. But I think the way in which we approach the conflict of interest actually carries a lot of weight. We need to identify that a conflict of interest needs to be identified. Firstly, that happens through reflection. It needs to be disclosed, especially to if it's anything relating to finances or in terms of potential impact to our standing. As well, it needs to be properly managed to maintain research integrity and importantly, public trust in research. And I think this is one of the key points that I would like to drive. We understand that we all understand the importance of the studies that we're doing, but if the integrity of that particular study is compromised, then what is the value if no one trusts what we're doing? So I think that's why when it comes to disclosing conflicts of interest, understanding them, defining them, that is why it is so important. So I think we've covered both these points about we defined it as well as what the importance of understanding a conflict of interest is. So, like I've discussed previously, I'd like to touch on 2 points in terms of conflicts of interest. And the first one's going to be financial. Now, many of us would be aware of examples of financial conflicts of interest, but let's go into a bit of detail. So as we said, we've grouped them into 2 broad categories. And if we look at financial conflicts, now these can include a variety of examples. So the first one we look at, let's just say your funding sources, or if a particular research group or a research company, in terms of stock ownership or consulting fees or any other monetary consideration. So whenever there is, let's just say you are doing a piece of research, but you are also going to directly benefit financially from it. Let's just say if you are running a clinical trial, as an example. So I'm from a science background, so please forgive me for the examples that I use, but we'll use this example. If you are, let's just say you are an independent research group, and what is happening is that you have been asked to perform a study on a particular drug, but you have stock ownership in that drug. Now that brings about a potential conflict of interest because obviously if there's a financial implication for you, someone could say that you are only passing this drug because obviously it benefits your pocket. So by disclosing these conflicts of interest, we can avoid all of these uncomfortable questions. The next type that we will speak about in a bit more detail is going to be that of non-financial conflicts. And these involve personal relationships, your academic rivalries, maybe some of your ideological biases, or even institutional pressures, which, many of us would be aware of. And this is not something that is located just in South Africa, but it is a global issue. I mean, when we speak to colleagues, be it from the UK or Spain or wherever it may be, we notice that there is a trend and an evolution of the academic environment. So in terms of institutional pressures, it is actually a global phenomenon. So it's important for us to understand that both of these or both types can potentially compromise research integrity, and therefore they require us to have careful management in how we approach them. It is important for us to note, if I can just go down here, it is important for us to note that having a conflict, once again, does not invalidate your research. Once again, we'll drive home the point that the key to managing a conflict of interest is proper disclosure as well as how you are managing it thereafter. So there are many different frameworks which exist in terms of identifying conflicts of interest. And I think for the purpose of this presentation, the 6 Ps, which has been developed, excuse me, which was developed by the Integrity Coordinating Group. And now this basically was formed to promote and strengthen integrity in public institutions in Western Australia. I think for the purpose of this presentation, it breaks it down quite nicely. So they've developed a framework known as the 6 Ps, and this is used to help researchers identify potential conflicts of interest. And we'll just go through each of these 6 Ps. So the first P, I probably should have put it up on the slides. I'm very sorry, but we'll just discuss this, right? So the first P is going to be public duty versus personal interest. Now, some of the questions that we can ask ourselves here is, do I have a personal interest that may conflict or be seen to conflict with my public duty? Now, when I mention here public duty, we all are researchers. We obviously want our research to make an impact in society around us. I mean, I would assume that many of us would want that. That's the ultimate goal, to improve the society around us. So would that becomes roles and responsibilities? So we should ask ourselves the question, do I have a personal interest that may conflict or be seen to conflict with my public duty in terms of presenting research which is of a high standard and also has integrity? Am I adjusting my results in such a way so it benefits me in terms of my profile within the university? But if this research is taken forward and obviously applied to the real world setting, is it going to cause harm to people that we see around us? The next P would involve potentialities. Now, this involves, could there be benefits for me or someone important to me now or in the future that could actually cast doubt on my integrity as a researcher? So these are questions that we should be asking ourselves. And I understand that this framework is obviously targeted towards when we are going into commercialization of our particular products, or we're hoping to step into industry. But I think if we have an understanding of what are some of the long-term implications, of not disclosing a conflict of interest, it can help us to develop these skills much earlier on in our research journeys. The next P, the third P, is actually going to involve perception. So this involves, how will my involvement in the decision, be viewed by others if they knew about my public duties and my interests, and then you can look at it from the point of a neutral person. So you say, would a neutral person think that these personal interests could conflict with my public duties? And how damaging could the perceptions be to me or my particular standing? We understand that when it comes to your trying to find the word. When it comes to your, say, your character, your reputation, it can take years for you to build it up, but obviously in a split second it can be destroyed. So these are things that we should actually be considering. So the fourth P is going to be proportionality. And this involves asking ourselves the question, does my involvement in the decision appear fair and reasonable in all circumstances? And I think it's important in this regard for us always to step out from our perspective and try to look at the situation from the perspective of someone else, shall we say. The fifth P is going to be presence of mind. So essentially, if you ignore the conflict of interests, what are the consequences going to be for yourself, for your research group, for your colleagues, to the public, as well as to your level, let's just say your position within the university? And the last one is going to be promises. So you can ask yourselves, have you made yourselves any promises or commitments in relation to this matter? So by asking ourselves these these few questions, we are able to identify any potential conflicts of interest. And many of you will be asking, why would I need a framework to identify a conflict of interest? Reason being is sometimes when we're looking at a situation, when we're looking at our research, we've been on this for, it can be years, sometimes even decades. We hear of people working on particular projects, and you become so invested, and your perspective is actually different to that of someone else. So in this case here, we're trying to ensure that every decision that we make, every piece of work that we put out there is unbiased. And obviously that's all going to add to the research integrity of what we're trying to achieve. So let's go a bit in detail in terms of financial conflicts of interest. And the first one we're going to talk about is going to be industry funding. So just bear with me. I apologize. I think I'm getting the cold, so I'll be taking a break to drink some water. So in terms of industry funding, this represents one of the most common sources of financial conflicts of interest, and many of us, can think of examples. So we understand that universities often encourage faculties to participate in the establishment of industry partnerships, as well as, they drive things like commercialization of novel technologies, and to accept company-sponsored research funding and to consult for private companies. Now, please understand that the information that I'm putting forward in this presentation today is not, it is just information that we've gathered. It's through experience as well that we've had and discussions that we have, and it's not a reflection, obviously, on any one particular university. So in terms of these, we understand that there is a drive for us to link the research which is being done in our labs and in our research groups to that in a real world application. In order for this to happen, we understand that research is very expensive, and obviously very often we will need some source of funding. So we understand that these relationships can be beneficial and provide additional research funding and facilitating the practical application of research findings. Now, we understand with every pro, there is generally a con. And we need to understand that they often require careful management. And this is essentially to ensure that the research questions, the methodologies that you're using, as well as importantly, the reporting of your results remain unbiased, as well as independent of commercial interests. So I think when it comes to your financial conflicts of interest, it's important for us to understand that, yes, while we will accept funding for a particular research project, whatever it may be, at the end of the day, nothing should ever threaten the integrity of our research. And I understand that it's easier said than done. And obviously, there are examples out there where we can look at. But I think that change starts with us. Or when I say change, rather, we can set the tone in terms of our research. So these are just some things to be aware of. The next example would be commercialization, and obviously something very important in intellectual property. So many universities, once again, encourage researchers to patent and license their inventions, especially those coming up in the research, because obviously there's numerous benefits to that. One thing that we actually have to be aware of is in terms of when researchers stand to gain financially from commercializing their research. However, conflicts can arise that might influence the study design, data interpretation, or publication decisions. So essentially, what are we seeing here? Whenever there is money involved, we need to ensure that the funding does not influence the outcome of our research. Funding is actually a tool which allows us to perform our research, and at the end of the day, your results is your results, and it should not be dictated by any external factor. I think back to, when I was in the lab, and let's just say we're performing an experiment. I think this was quite early on in my studies, and the experiment did not work. And automatically, I was quite heartbroken because it took me quite a while to work on this particular experiment. And I remember talking to my professor, and the advice they gave us is that, what, no result is a bad result. A negative result is not necessarily a bad result. It is pointing you in the direction and showing you things that don't work. So essentially, the point that I'm trying to drive here is that at the end of the day, the results that we get from our experiments, from our research, is what we have to move forward with and try to link that and look at how we can obviously improve future steps. So we're going to go quickly on to what are some examples of non-financial conflicts of interest. And the first one is going to be personal and professional relationships. So many of us, when we think of conflicts of interest and we think of finances, we think that this is actually, the biggest issue. But we need to understand that non-financial conflicts can also be equally as important for us to manage, to identify as well. So let's look in terms of personal and professional relationships, right? So if you consider a peer reviewer, and let's put ourselves in the situation. So you consider a peer reviewer who is evaluating a study, and they basically evaluating a paper or they're reviewing a paper, and this paper actually decreases the importance of your own work. So many of us, so I pose the question, does this lead to a conflict of interest? Because I think it could lead to a conflict of interest, because if you don't disclose it necessarily. So this could lead to in a hypothetical situation, this could lead to the reviewer to recommend a rejection of the study, or even if the study itself, has academic merit to it. So in terms of personal relationships with research participants, colleagues, or competitors, These can also create conflicts of interest that influence research decisions. These types of conflicts, they may actually be harder for us to identify than the financial ones, but they require the same level of transparency as well as how we approach them and how we manage them as well. Um, and then we move on to institutional pressure, institutional and career pressures. So, institutional pressures, many of us would have heard the saying publish or perish. And this culture can actually create a conflict between the need for career advancement as well as research integrity. Now, let me once again, put a disclaimer in here. I'm not saying that this need for us to publish is actually going to cause people to lose their integrity, but I'm saying that in certain situations, people may find it as, you know what, I either compromise my integrity or you know what, I get fired from my job because I'm not meeting the standard and the number of publications that I need. So when we do some research online, we identify that research shows that individualism and performance as one of the key ethical issues in research. So basically, when we look at it from our own perspective, right, and what pressures may be put on us. So essentially, when the success of your career depends on publication quantity and impact, many researchers may face conflict between a thorough, careful science and the pressure to produce your results quickly. I think back to a discussion that I had with a professor. He's actually retired now, and he mentioned that back in his day, which was like, I think he started about 40 or 50 years ago, is when he first joined academia. And he said, you know, you would have months or even years to work on a particular study, and thereafter you will aim to publish in a high impact factor journal. But obviously we understand that today the landscape has evolved and there's different pressures arising on us. So he actually said, you know what, he doesn't, and he's quite distinguished in his field. He actually pointed out that he says that he does not think that they would have been able to survive in today's academic environment while still publishing at the quality that was required back then as well as what is required now. So I think it's just something for us to be aware of. And I think essentially it all boils down to the systemic pressures that we actually are aware of require both individual awareness as well as institutional solutions, because obviously we can't work just on our own. So, in terms of what the institutional approaches, we can talk about disclosure requirements. And this essentially covers if you have a particular conflict of interest, it is important for you to disclose that you have that particular conflict of interest. And there's various channels that we can actually go through. So we understand that most research institutions actually have established policies that define what a potential conflict of interest is, and it also provides guidelines and procedures for limiting and managing them. So we understand that one of the key factors of this policy is actually disclosure. It is important. That's your first step always. If you notice that there is a conflict of interest, your first point of contact would be go to your line manager, go to your researcher, or the leader of your group, or even your HOD, whoever it may be, and disclose this potential conflict of interest and have it down in writing. Okay, it is important that this reporting is transparent, especially when it comes to conflicts of interest, and this must be communicated to the relevant stakeholders. And this includes obviously the university, if you're receiving funding from an external source, let's just say if there's a journal, a journal that you're submitting a paper to, and even sometimes to the public. And obviously this will be dependent on the particular situation that you find yourself in. So in terms of disclosure requirements typically cover financial relationships above certain thresholds. So if once again you are doing a study to test the validity of a drug for a pharmaceutical company, and they give you a gift at the end of, just say thank you for all of your hard work, whatever it may be, that will have to be disclosed, especially if it's above a certain threshold, because let's just say they send you a box of chocolates, versus 50,000 Rand into your account. And that is seen very differently. So I think just to protect ourselves, if ever you are given a gift, especially when you are performing research and it's directly benefiting a company or an individual, it's important for us to disclose that at all levels. And I think these are some of the things that, as researchers, generally, we're quite happy in the research space, but in terms of everything else that goes on in terms of commercialization, there's a lot that we need to make ourselves aware of. So disclosure, very important. Basically, any other activity which could appear to affect the objectivity and integrity of your research, it's important for us to disclose. So once again, we'll put in a disclaimer here that while disclosure alone does not eliminate your conflict, it is the first step in learning how to manage the process. Okay, how to manage this conflict of interest. So we're being transparent, we're being honest, and by doing this here, we're maintaining the integrity of our research as well. So I can see that I am just talking. If there's anyone that would like to jump in at any time or any points that you would like to bring up or maybe a certain point of discussion, please feel free. I would be happy to, to discuss with you guys as well. So we're going to move on to in terms of management strategies for conflicts of interest. And the first one, well, we're going to go through some practical approaches to managing conflicts. So we understand that when it comes to managing a conflict of interest, there are many different strategies that can be used, right? But the key point is first we need to identify them. So once we've identified a potential conflict of interest, be it financial or non-financial, then we can go about basically managing this conflict of interest. So first steps, let's go through it. The first one's going to be complete disclosure to all stakeholders. So if you have a conflict of interest, let the university know, let your funders know. If you're publishing a paper, let the journal article know, or the publication house know, etc. Right? So let's just look at if you are modifying in terms of research roles. How do I put this in a context? Okay. Let's just say that you are leading a particular research group and a project comes into your research where you have to test the validity of a particular product. However, you have a direct financial interest in that product. So what are some of the steps that you can use? Number one, you will disclose to all the stakeholders, you know what, I am actually involved in this particular company, or I do own shares in this company, and I want to avoid any potential conflicts of interest. And what is the next step that you can do? You can actually change your research role. So instead of being the leader on the group, you can actually step back from some of the primary decisions relating to this particular study, or you can alternatively even take a step back, if possible, from this entire study as it goes. The next step is that you could implement independent oversight, and this can be through independent review or through monitoring. So basically, you can get a senior member of your research group to actually have oversight over the entire project, and they would be able to attest to the fact that all protocols were carried out, the results are valid, and it just adds to, obviously, prevents any uncomfortable questions being asked later on. There are some other extreme examples. So this would be more for people who are like, invested in terms of a lot of money. So divestment of financial interests when conflicts cannot otherwise be managed. I was actually listening to a podcast, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, and a bit unrelated, but essentially what was happening is that it was dealing with the Senate in the US government, and one of the senators was actually presenting some stats, and he said in one of the previous administrations, if they looked at the number of millionaires in terms of those people working for the government, it stood at, let's just say hypothetically, 10%. However, when there was transition between different administrations, they noticed that number jumped from 10% hypothetically to, let's just say, 60%. And they were just trying to understand what exactly was going on and why people were not disclosing their conflicts of interest. And one of the solutions that they actually presented was that if you wish to be in the Senate or in the US government, the moment that you take up office, you actually need to divest all of your financial interests when your conflicts cannot be otherwise managed. This, I think, is quite an extreme example because Generally we would hope those that are in these positions would not use these positions for financial gain, but then again, it may not be the case for every individual. So once again, the last thing you can actually do is actually remove yourself from that specific research activity or any important decision-making process. And we'll notice this. Let's look at it for an example in the university, right? Let's just say that you, as an emerging researcher, is actually applying for a position within your department. And the chair of the interview board is actually going to be your supervisor. Does this bring about a conflict of interest? Yes, it does. Because if you are successful for the role, even if you meet every single criteria and you've done excellently in your interview, it can raise potential questions as to the validity of the decision. So in that case, what do we notice? I mean, it's happened with previous supervisors that I've had. They've actually removed themselves from the interview process completely when it came to them interviewing their students. So that's maybe more of a practical example or application that we can see. So we're going to go through a couple of case studies. I'm going to try and be, once again, as quick as possible with this. The first case study we're going to look at is going to be that of pharmaceutical research. So let's think about it like this and look at an example of a potential conflict of interest. So a pharmaceutical company, let's just say it sponsors research on its own product. Now, just as a disclaimer, many pharmaceutical companies, from the limited experience that I have in that area, many pharmaceutical companies actually do sponsor the clinical trials relating to the approval of their drug. Now, this is always disclosed, and there are clear guidelines about what the sponsorship can actually involve, and in terms of any financial gifting or anything or payments of that sort. There's strict guidelines when it comes to pharmaceutical companies. So studies have shown that industry-sponsored research is more likely to produce favorable results for the sponsor's products. Now, this is once again a hypothetical situation, right? So in terms of potential management strategies, what do you think that we can include here? In terms of, I'm a pharmaceutical company, but I am paying you to basically perform a study to prove that my drug actually works. So how do we go about doing this? So the management strategies will involve ensuring that the study design, data analysis, as well as preparation of the paper or the manuscript are actually controlled by independent researchers, right? Also, it's important in this sort of scenario for them to pre-register the study protocols to prevent selective reporting. So essentially, how do we go about this? In terms of a pharmaceutical company and the performing research, the first thing they would do is that all of the data that is being produced will have to be obviously documented, and any analysis and writing of the paper, generally they will find an independent body to actually perform it. So we'll see that they are separate entities which are involved throughout the entire process. And essentially what they're trying to do here is to maintain the integrity of their own research as well. Once again, we'll notice when we're reading many journal articles, we'll notice that in the acknowledgement section, there will be an acknowledgement of the funders. So if we look at a drug, let's just say that's treating asthma, and hypothetically, if it is being produced by Pfizer, and Pfizer pays a doctor and his research group to run the clinical trial, in the paper that the doctor has actually written, it will be acknowledged that funding was provided by so-and-so in this particular to this particular effect. And the next case study we're going to look at is going to be in terms of academic entrepreneurship. So in this scenario, we consider a professor who starts up, who founds a startup company based on their research discoveries. So in this situation here, does it bring up a conflict of interest in terms of, especially if they are performing the research, which is testing and proving the validity of their particular product. So I'm just trying to look for an example. So what can we learn from both of these case studies, which we've been through very briefly? I think that we notice that it is impossible for us to avoid conflict of interest, especially when we're moving from just the research space to more commercialization and application in the real world. But some of the key points that we understand that we have to cover is obviously identify the conflict of interest. The next one is going to be to disclose, I am conflicted. You will take the necessary steps to ensure the integrity of your particular research. Once again, we want to drive home the point that a conflict of interest does not necessarily mean that your research is invalidated. How we address the conflict of interest is actually going to be equally as important. And we need to ensure at all times that our research is actually being used for the greater good and is not just being conducted for financial gain, especially for us as researchers as well. So, we've defined what a conflict of interest is. We've given some examples of financial versus non-financial conflicts of interest. We've briefly gone through some case studies. And now we come to the point where we identify what are some of the obstacles in managing conflicts of interest. Why does managing conflicts of interest, why can it be so challenging? So we understand that there are clear policies, guiding us on how to manage conflicts of interest. However, this does face several obstacles. So one of the first ones is that us as researchers, we may not recognize our own biases and believing that we can actually remain objective despite the conflicts. And this, I think, is something that each of us will have to evaluate on our own, in terms of, many of us will believe that we can be unbiased, but how will it also look in terms of public perception and how will it affect the integrity of our research? These are some key considerations we need to take into mind. In terms of other obstacles will be institutional resources in terms of reviewing and managing these conflicts of interest may actually be limited. So if you've identified something, maybe a particular university does not have clear guidelines in terms of how you manage it, you go by what you feel is best, and therefore later down the road, you realize that, I've gone in completely the wrong direction. And then we've also mentioned competitive pressures in academia. This can discourage disclosure, especially if the researchers fear being compared to less transparent competitors. And then we come across the example as well too in certain fields, the collaboration which exists between industry and academia is actually so strong that things which are actually or should not be normalized have now become normalized. And because it is the norm within the field, we are unable to identify it. So I think the key point here is that we must always be critical of our work, as I'm sure each of us are, and as well as try to identify any potential conflicts of interests in terms of, in terms of a research setting. I think an important one that I'd also like to mention is, there've been examples where people submit their papers to journals where they know their friends are editors in. And I think this actually raises a huge conflict of interest because it actually affects the credibility of your own research, especially if your research is completely sound and you've done everything correctly, but maybe you want to fast track the approval process or you're under certain pressures. So these are all conflicts of interest that we need to try and obviously avoid at all costs. So what are some best practices in terms of us as researchers and some proactive approaches in order for us to address and limit these conflicts of interest? So there are several practices we can actually bring on board. The first one is, I think many of us will be aware of this, would be to familiarize yourself with institutional policies before the conflicts arise. Now, many of us would not think to necessarily do this, but I think it'll be important for us to read through the guidelines, especially that set out by UJ, to understand what do they define as a conflict of interest? How do I go about disclosing it? What is the necessary steps I need to do in order to protect myself as well as my research? We need to always be proactive about disclosure, even when uncertain whether something constitutes a conflict. I think if it raises a question in your mind, in terms of a conflict of interest, then I think that, you should act upon that and at least have a discussion and put something down in writing that you've actually approached someone and try to find more information around the guidelines surrounding this. Always document your decision-making processes to demonstrate your objectivity. Coming for those who, let me just say this here, I'll speak for myself. When I was working in the lab, we were told that every single step that you perform in the lab in terms of an experiment, you mark it down. If there's a change in temperature, if you are increasing the rate of a particular reaction, whatever it may be, every step needs to be documented, because when it comes time and your research is being questioned, you can refer back to these notes and, be able to, be able to back up your decision-making process. We noticed that UJ actually has obviously the ethics board, and you can actually consult with these ethics experts or committees when facing unfamiliar situations. And I think it's important for us to foster a culture of transparency, especially by discussing conflicts openly with colleagues, as well as those people who maybe those students who we are supervising. I think in terms of transparency, this is something that many people are actually working on, because if we look at many research papers which are being published today, when you try to replicate the results from them as an example, we notice that key steps have been left out. And this, in my opinion, is actually a lack of transparency, because if I want to test your experiment or I want to test your research, it should be reproducible. It should not be a once-off thing. So transparency moves beyond just conflicts of interest. I think it moves to and can be incorporated, it should be incorporated in every single area of academia, in terms of our interaction with the public, our interaction with funders, in terms of our research. And obviously change always starts with us as well. Not that there is, once again, disclaimer, not that I say that there is anything unethical going on, but obviously we want to try and bring about this culture where even new students coming in understand that the importance of transparency, as well as reproducibility and integrity of our research as well. And the last point I'd like to end up on this section is to remember that having a conflict of interest, especially in your research, doesn't make it unethical. However, if you fail to manage them appropriately, that is where the concern comes in, because we should be able to disclose it, we should be able to discuss it, and thereof always, as the point I keep driving home, is protect the integrity of our research as well. Okay, so we've done with the first section. I think ethical dilemmas is a bit more for discussion. So please, if anyone has anything to add, please feel free to jump in. If there's anything that you would like to discuss or even disagree with, please feel free to either raise your hand or unmute your mic and just speak. So in terms of ethical dilemmas in research, I want to make a clear distinction between a conflict of interest versus an ethical dilemma. So in terms of an ethical dilemma, how can we define this? An ethical dilemma essentially arises when researchers face situations where there are competing ethical principles, and where for you to identify which is the right choice for you to make when this decision is not clear. Let's just look at an example. If you are performing research, shall we say, and we understand that the experiment that you're going to perform is going to cause harm to another person, there's no ethical dilemma there. You understand that you can't perform the experiment. Why? Because at all times, the health and safety of a person comes before any form of research. But then we'll go through some examples now where they pose some interesting questions, asking that what if scenarios. Let's just leave it at that. So unlike a conflict of interest, which we've discussed previously, which involves personal interests, potentially compromising your research, when it comes to an ethical dilemma, they can arise even when researchers have no personal stake in the outcome. So an ethical dilemma is basically you stuck between a rock and a hard place, essentially. And the right decision or the correct decision is not always as clear. So we notice that in terms of guiding these principles, your research ethics board members, ethics experts, They recognize multiple ethical issues in research, including, let's just talk about research integrity, conflicts of interest, respect for participants. We can mention lack of supervision and power imbalances, individualism, performance, and inadequate ethical guidance. So essentially, all of these factors here can actually bring about ethical dilemmas because we do not have a clear framework. So when we brought about an ethical dilemma, I think, yes, we have to look at the situation objectively. We have to look at all of the facts, but we also have to try and align ourselves according to the guidelines and seek advice, obviously, whenever is needed, whenever there could be some potential harm to people. So let's speak about some key ethical principles in research. So there are several key ethical principles which we use to guide research, especially when it's relating to human participants. And the first one is going to be respect for people or respect for persons. And this involves the right for everyone to have autonomy over their own decisions. And this brings up an entire different conversation as well, obviously, in different settings. So what does this principle involve? Essentially, it underlies the requirement for informed consent in terms of your research. So if you are performing a survey, if you are performing a clinical trial, you need to make participants aware at all stages in terms of what information they're going to be given, what is the information going to be used for, what is the potential impact on them. And obviously, it brings up questions surrounding POPIA and protection of your personal information, all of these things. So if we move on from that, we'll see that other key principles include considering maximizing the benefit of your research while minimizing the harm. So there should always be, in terms of your research, you want to limit any harm to people, obviously, or avoid it at all costs. We can mention things such as justice, which means fair distribution of your benefits, or even if there's something negative arising from your research. And we understand that ethical dilemmas often arise when these principles come into tension with each other or with practical research considerations. So look at it from this perspective here. Once again, I'm going to look at the example of a clinical trial. And in the clinical trial, we notice that generally there are two groups. The first one is going to be the test group, or let's just say you have three groups, right? You have the control group, and then you'll have a test group, and then you'll have a placebo group. And let's just create the scenario where a pharmaceutical company is testing a revolutionary cancer drug, which is said to cure lung cancer. Okay. Now, in order for the results to be valid, you need to have a test group and a placebo group. Why? Because you need to see if the drug is actually what is causing the cancer to go into remission. But does this pose an ethical dilemma to many of us? Because we understand that in each of these groups, people are not going to know whether they're taking the placebo or if they're going to be taking the actual drug which can help cure them. Does it raise an ethical dilemma in terms of how we select the participants? Because obviously, at the end of the day, we would want to ensure that everyone gets healed. But if we treat everyone with the drug, then that means that it affects negatively the validity of the actual experiment itself. So these are some examples of ethical dilemmas that we will face in research, especially in clinical research. So in terms of common ethical dilemmas, the first one's going to be informed consent. And this involves balancing disclosure with your research goals. So we understand that in terms of informed consent, especially in ethical research with human participants, informed consent is actually crucial. This ensures that participants can make an informed decision about participation. However, we understand that in some studies, disclosing in advance the goals of the study or the organization, whoever's conducting the study, could actually jeopardize the validity of your research, as we just discussed previously, as participants may not act naturally or might actually change their behavior. So if we think about it quite simply, if we look in terms of a clinical trial once again, if you have two groups and you tell group A, I'm giving you the drug and you tell group B, I'm actually giving you a placebo. Firstly, that's going to invalidate the results. Secondly, how many people are actually going to want to take the placebo? They may just want to go and join another clinical trial and give themselves a better chance of being cured. So this is an ethical dilemma in terms of how do we make these decisions? And, in this case, are we putting the benefit of people above the research or the research before the people? But then we also have to take into consideration what is the broader impact of the study going to be. If we are able to establish that this particular anti-cancer drug is safe and can actually bring about healing, complete healing in cancer, then millions of lives could be saved. So when it comes to ethical dilemmas, essentially we're saying that it's not a clear-cut answer. And there's many different factors for you to consider. If we consider it just on a personal opinion basis, obviously everyone's opinion is going to be different. So therefore, we need some guidelines in about how we go about this. The next ethical dilemma would be relating to concealment and deception. And this also relates to the previous point when full disclosure will actually compromise your research. So in terms of this, concealment refers to the situation where some important information about the study, this would usually be in the consent form, is withheld from the research participants, and this is generally during the consent gathering process. So that's concealment, right? In terms of deception, deception goes much further by actively providing false information to participants. Now, both of these approaches actually raise ethical concerns about the autonomy of a participant. However, they may be necessary for certain research questions. And that is why we leave these sorts of decisions up to ethics committees, because in that situation is not just you making a decision based on your perspective. It is a committee of experts which get together, they weigh the pros and the cons, and they try to make a decision or make recommendations which will actually limit harm, but also improve the quality and the integrity of the research as well. So in terms of your ethics committees, they typically will require debriefing after such studies and careful justification as to why the research couldn't be conducted with full disclosure. So once again, we understand that even when we have these difficult decisions, full disclosure, or rather disclosing it to the ethics committee, is actually going to be very important. Another point we can speak about would be sensitive research topics. And this is when your research may cause distress. So we can look at examples. If you're conducting a survey and your target group is going to be people who have been attacked, or maybe those who have been mugged, whatever it may be, your questions may actually cause distress to them because obviously they'll be reliving the events of a traumatic experience. So in this case here, we need to take into consideration, what trauma is it going to bring about? What is the effect going to be on their mental health? Is there going to be a level of discrimination if their results or their names are disclosed, or other difficult experiences? Will this trigger emotional distress in the participants? And in this situation, you can't exactly go and study another population because your study is focused primarily on those who obviously have been through a traumatic experience. So in this case here, researchers must balance the value of generating the knowledge from the study on these important topics, which obviously can be used to help thousands, if not millions of people, against the potential harm to the individual participants. Now, these are extremely difficult decisions for anyone to make, and that is why it often requires a panel. In terms of strategies to manage this dilemma, it will include careful screening of the participants. Yes, you would require, obviously, your target group is those, let's just say, who have been physically assaulted. However, maybe you can look at it on a case-by-case basis in terms of severity of the assault, or in terms of is the person able to actually go through the study? So this will involve careful screening of the participants, maybe providing clear information about the content of the study, and having trained researchers who can respond appropriately to distress, and obviously have available support resources available, as well as always make it clear that participants are able to withdraw from the study at any point. There was a student who came in recently, And their study essentially was centered around this, where there was, I think it was like something similar to domestic abuse or domestic violence rather. And what they actually identified that one of the suggestions from the ethics committee was for them to have a trained psychologist present at all times when they're conducting the interviews, because in case people were reliving their, the difficult experiences, there would be someone who's trained there to actually um, help the participants. So in this case here, yes, you are getting your research and your data that you need to complete your study, but at the end of the day, you're also still trying to protect the participants, which should be our priority at all times. And moving towards the end now, we're going to speak about vulnerable populations. So we understand that research with vulnerable populations will create particular ethical dilemmas. So we can look at maybe individuals who may have mental health issues, or maybe certain individuals who may have difficulties in terms of their mental faculties. So when it comes to research surrounding this, we need to have clear guidelines and specific considerations to ensure that at all time we are not taking advantage of these particular groups, and that the research that we're doing in the experiments that we're using, if it is causing any harm to the people or even the potential to cause harm, that there is absolutely no other option but to perform this. And then you need to have a strong backup as to, is a study actually necessary, putting these vulnerable populations through distress. Then we're going to go on to confidentiality challenges, which basically means protecting participants' privacy. And here we can speak about, protection of your private, your personal information, as well as if participants are revealing sensitive information, or when there's a risk of the confidential being compromised due to a small participant pool. How do we go about protecting this? I think that would be one of the key things. So we understand that researchers, or as researchers, we must balance their commitment to protect, participant privacy against other ethical obligations, such as the mandatory reporting of certain disclosures, especially if it is, an example, if you find out something with child abuse, or the need to publish detailed quantitative accounts that might actually let the public know about who your target group or individuals actually were. So how do we balance competing ethical considerations? So many ethical dilemmas actually involve tensions between two or more ethical principles. We'll look at the example of the respect for persons. Now, the respect for a person and obviously their security may actually conflict with scientific, say, validity of your experiment, and therefore this may actually require some concealment. So in this case here, how do we balance the two? And I think that we need to have clear guidelines in terms of how we go about addressing, balancing competing ethical considerations. At the end of the day, we need to look about what is the study actually going to bring to the field? What is the benefit it's going to have to people? Are we just performing the study for the sake of it because we want another publication, which is going to look good on our resume? Or will there be real world impact in terms of assisting this particular population that we are actually putting under study? So I'm not going to spend too much time on these case studies as well. I think we've discussed them, but I'll leave them. I'll add more notes when we are uploading these slides onto the Moodle communities. The first one's going to be a case study of deception in psychological research. So if you look at an example of a dilemma in terms of psychological research, particularly in studies that involve deceptions. So in this case, a researcher might tell participants they're studying one thing when they're actually trying to measure something else. And this is essentially done to prevent the participants from acting in a certain way, which will skew your results. Now, this can actually create some sort of tension, especially between a researcher, between the integrity and validity of the experiment versus the respect for a person's autonomy, for them to know what's going on. Because at the end of the day, they're giving consent for A, but you are studying B. So it brings up ethical dilemmas there. And obviously requires clear guidelines and should be used as a last resort in many cases. So Approaching the end of this presentation, we're just going to go through some best practices in terms of navigating ethical dilemmas and what are some practical approaches for researchers. So there are several practices which we can use or which can be used to help researchers to navigate ethical dilemmas effectively. And the first one is going to be to anticipate potential dilemmas during the study design. So this involves when we're creating our studies to critically analyze it, not only from a point of is it scientifically sound or is it sound in terms of research, but also are there any ethical dilemmas which can arise from this? Are there going to be potential harm to your participants, anything of that sort? Are you going to have to study vulnerable groups, etc.? So it's always good to be proactive. So be as proactive as possible. Try and preempt any of these issues rather than waiting until they arise and you deep into your study, and then you're going to have to adjust, obviously, protocols at that point. We can also always consult ethics guidelines and literature, especially specific to your research area. Now, I've been speaking a lot on, obviously, from a scientific perspective or a science background, but we understand that in terms of ethics, there are going to be certain similarities across all disciplines, especially if you're working with people, where respect for autonomy, respect for privacy, protection of the person, not putting them in direct harm, all of these would be standard. So if, as we are generating our study or forming our study design, consult with the ethical guidelines, and as well as we always will be reading up on the literature specific to our area. Then we've mentioned previously, I think in conflicts of interest, would be to document your decision-making process and the reasoning why. And I think just write down as much information as you can, as much detail as would be necessary, because you may remember the full details for your decision today, but 6 months, 2 years, 5 years from now, it may not be as clear. And I think it's always important for us as researchers to seek diverse perspectives, especially from those who might be affected by the research. Don't only look at it from your point of view, but also look at it from the point of view of the person who's being studied. We can also go one step further where we build ethics reflection into research team meetings. And I think importantly, we need to remember that ethical research is actually an ongoing process. And it involves us reflecting on what we've done as well as adjustment and not just a one-time approval, and therefore it's set in stone afterwards. So in summary, we've covered two aspects in terms of conflicts of interest and ethical considerations. I hope there's been at least some points which would be useful in terms of this presentation. And with that, we would like to welcome any questions or contributions anyone may have in terms of the presentation. So once again, thank you all for your attention. And if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. Or alternatively, you can just raise your hand or unmute your mic and speak. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. David, for a very informative presentation. To the colleagues, now it's your turn to ask questions, or if you do have any inputs, just unmute your mic, or alternatively, you can type under the chat, and then we will go through your inputs. While we still waiting questions, Dr. Lorenzo, just a quick one on my side. How do you approach ethical dilemmas when your personal values seem to conflict with your supervisor expectations or with the institution?
I think, yeah, that's a very good question, Kosi. Thank you for asking that. I think, we have to evaluate on a case-by-case basis what is important to us as a person, and the decision that we're making, would we be able to live with that decision 5 years from now, 10 years from now, moving on? Because at the end of the day, none of us would want to compromise our integrity, even for a research paper. So I think that if your personal values are being put under scrutiny and there's some conflict that's happening there, I think your first point would always be to discuss this, to have an open discussion with your supervisor, or let's just say if it's someone from the university, and explain that, you know what, what is your point of view? Why do you believe that this is going to be, something that goes against your values? And if you strongly believe that, you know what, this is something that you can't live with, then I think that some sort of amicable decision can be made in terms of it. I think at the end of the day, in my own personal capacity, in my own personal opinion, I believe that our own integrity as researchers and as people, above all else, actually comes before any sort of monetary or accolade that could arise from that. So I think in that case, have a discussion with the, let's just say, the representative or your supervisor, explain your point of view, and if you can't come to an agreement, then you can always obviously escalate that further. So I hope that answers your question, Nkosi, in terms of, yeah.
Yes, Doc, very clear. Thank you so much for that. Colleagues, if you do have a question, just unmute your mic or just type under the chat. Just to add on, Doc, you talk about disclosing financial contributions or in a collaboration.
Yeah.
How one can go around that of disclosing financial or personal relationships?
Okay, so I think let's just say at the start of the study, you are forming a collaboration with another university in South Africa, and they are actually funding your research, shall we say. It's always important. We will have to disclose that funding is coming in because obviously it's going into the cost center. But let's look at it in terms of a company that is funding a particular research. You would have, if you are the leader, let's just say, of your research group, then you will disclose this, or you will disclose the university, and you'll disclose it to the lead of your department, shall we say, and you document in terms of your what exactly the funding is, what is it going to cover, and obviously that is actually going to be built into your proposal as well in terms of the project when you applied for it in the first place. So I think disclose it to your academic leader or to your research group leader. And when it comes time for you to actually publish, also make it known to the university. There are obviously legal divisions that you can consult with regards to this, and they will just make sure that everything is on par. And then when it comes time to the publication, obviously you will have to disclose any sources of funding, and this will generally be done in your acknowledgements or disclosure section of the paper as well. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Nkosi. Nkosi, are you there? You seem to have... Oh, you're back.
Sorry, Doc, can you hear me?
Yeah, no, I can hear you now. Sorry, you disappeared for a while.
Yeah, my network, I think it's
Sorry.
Wi-Fi, which
Oh, sorry.
disappeared and it was disconnecting me. So thank you for your input once again. Colleagues, if you do have a question, please just raise a hand and ask your question. I've shared a registration link for the RCT management system on the chat. You can try to register your profile, or alternatively just go to ULink, and then after that you go to services, and the last option is RCT-MS. So that is whereby you'll be getting all the services that we are providing. You can register for any workshops that are upcoming, or you can even access the previous workshops and all the events that we are offering at the Research Capacity Development Unit, because we will now be moving out of the model communities as well as sending direct emails. So if you want to get or be in touch with all the offerings that we are providing, please do register your profile. It's take about a minute, some information already populated, because your profile is linked with your UJ account. So just activate your account and you will be good to go. If you are having any problems with registration, email us on supervision course or my email address that is typed that I typed on the chat, and and then I will schedule a meeting, a Teams meeting to assist you with any registration problems or queries. Thank you for that.
I
I
think,
don't know if anyone has a question. Doc, you were saying?
sorry, Nkosi, I think if anyone's interested, I think we can take literally 5 minutes just to go through the system to make people aware of it and just to show them step by step. And obviously, if there's any registration issues, they can contact us separately. Would that be okay?
Yes, that is fine with me. I don't know with the colleagues that are here with us if they will be interested. Anyone who wants assistance or guidance with the registration process.
Okay. Okay. Uh, Thank you, Dr. Noel. Okay. So I'll just quickly share my screen once again. Okay. Nkosi, can you just confirm that you're able to see my screen, please? The RCD postgraduate school screen.
Not yet.
Okay. Now?
Yes, now I can
Okay.
see it.
Okay. So, colleagues, essentially what you're going to do is, and I'll take you from both perspectives, right? Let's just say that you log in with, you go into Ulink, you log in with your normal credentials, and we'll notice that you'll obviously come into your profile. What you will need to do at this stage is to go to services, and you'll see at the bottom you have an RCDMS tab. You essentially just click on that and it automatically will take you into our system. So because you've logged into Ulink, you don't have to re-log into the system. And once you here, so I'm in student view at the moment. Once you are here, you are able to perform a variety of tasks. The first one would be in terms of events. So you would be able to go through month by month. So let's just say April and May. You'd be able to go through all of the workshops, seminars, panel discussions, trainings that the RCD is actually offering. Let's just look at today is the 16th of April. So we'll look one day in advance. We'll look at collaboration in research using digital tools for team communication and project management. If this is something that is of interest to you, you can view the event. And then what you would do is obviously, well, the registration is not open for this at the moment. So maybe let's look for a better example. Close this down. Let's look at, there we go. Okay, so if we're looking at this example, writing an effective abstract introduction and literature review, we go to your event and all you do is you click register for event. By clicking register for the event, all of your details that you have previously populated onto the system will now automatically be used in terms of, well, you logged in and you can see there's an email that pops up telling you that you have actually registered for the event as well. You can also cancel your registration at any point. And if we go back here, you'll notice that, so that's in terms of your trainings, right? You also can make yourself aware of any announcements that we have. If you would like to book a writing consultation session, or if you know of any of your students who'd like to book it, they can use the RCDMS through the book appointment where they choose their particular consultant, list their supervisor, what type of visit it's going to be, upload their document, and obviously this will book their, excuse me, this will automatically book your session. You will also get an email confirming your attendance for that particular session. So just one thing I'd like us to go through is if you are unable to log in via Ulink, you can also visit literally rcdms.uj.ac.za and you can register, you can basically log in with your email address. So let's just say there, and if I put in my password, but which is actually maybe not the best. Let's do it here. Once again, you'll be able to log in from here and obviously perform all of the same functions as well. You'll notice that in terms of the event itself, it's broken up. If you click on a certain color, it'll say published. And then sometimes you'll have an event which is proposed, which means that it has not been finalized yet, but we've blocked out this particular time so you can be aware of what we are offering over the next couple of months, and obviously adjust your schedule if it's something that you would like to attend. I think in terms of going through the system, that would be it from my side. But if you are having any issues in terms of registration, like Mr. Nkosi has said, please feel free to pop us an email. Alternatively, we can actually do a Teams call with you individually and walk you through the process. If you are on campus today and you're having some issues, if you pass in the library, I think Mr. Nkosi and Mr. Lawrence Asani from the RCD team will also be posted at the APK campus, and they will be able to assist you in person as well. I think that's all from my side, Nkosi. I don't know if you'd like to, I'll hand over back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. David, for that. I do hope and believe that colleagues here now have a clear understanding of what are we talking about when we talk about the RCD management system. It's a one-stop shop whereby you will be accessing all our services. So, colleagues, forgive me, my line is a little bit breaking. I'm having a bad network here. So that is why I was disconnected for a while. But yeah, so I don't know with the colleagues that are here, anyone who will need assistance with the registration, just send us an email, or if you will like to get any assistance probably to for us to take to take you through the system and explaining all the tabs and so on, we can arrange a Teams meeting with you, and then we will be able to guide you and take you step by step further. So I don't know if any colleagues do have a question regarding the topic of today or the discussion of today, which was presented by Dr. Lorenzo David. So anyone with a question regarding the workshop or the management system? Yes, Dr. Noel, you can go ahead.
All right, thank you. I think I have maybe you can organize with me for just a short Teams meeting, because I did send an email, but you said I'm registered. But when I tried to log in into the system using the other's way of saying using my email address, I'm failing. It is just saying the email you are using is not found, even if I try to change the password, whatever. So maybe soon after this meeting, you can arrange a meeting for me. Then we can go through the system. Thank you.
Okay, Doc, that is noted. We will arrange a meeting with you. If I can ask to you to just type your email address, and then I will arrange a meeting after this.
Where should I type?
On the chat. On the chat, it's fine. I will just copy it and arrange a meeting after.
Okay, it's fine.
Okay, thank you for that. Anyone, colleagues, with an input, suggestion, question? Okay, I see that we don't have any question. Thank you, Dr. Noel, for that. I've noted your email address. I will just Teams call you after this workshop. With the absence of question, I think it's safe to end our session or presentation, Dr. David. Is that okay with you?
That's fine with me, Nkosi. Thank you, Mr. Nkosi.
Okay. Thank you so much, colleagues, once again for your attending. And for your contribution as well. And to our facilitator, Dr. Lorenzo David, thank you for taking your time and facilitating today's workshop. We really appreciate your effort, and to the colleagues who made this workshop a possible one, for your attendance and taking your time to attend today's workshop. Thank you so much. Remember, colleagues, I've shared a feedback evaluation. We kindly request you to take your 2 minutes and fill that feedback evaluation. It help us in terms of reporting purposes, as well as to improve our service delivery at the University of Johannesburg. So with that being said, colleagues, I can now safely end the session, and you can have a great day further. Thank you so much for your attendance.
Thank you.